Welcome everybody, and thanks so much to Kootenay Conservation Program for asking me to join this webinar. So our project for the Kootenay Lake Local Conservation Fund is very new this year, and I'm just going to start with a brief introduction to our organization and myself as well. So as Marcy mentioned, my name is Erin Bates. I'm this Central Kootenay Invasive Species Society's Executive Director. I've been in this position for a little over a year now. So we were founded in 2005. We currently have about 258 members. And basically our mission is to protect ecosystems and communities in the Central Kootenay region by preventing and reducing the harmful impacts of invasive species. So we've been doing that for 15 years now. Very exciting. As you can see by this map, our operational area is all of the RDCK plus a little bit of the RDKB. So we certainly encompass the Kootenay Lake Local Conservation Area. So a little overview of this project. Knotweeds are by far the highest priority invasive plant in British Columbia. And a lot of money and effort goes into managing the various species of knotweeds throughout our province every year between various provincial and regional, as well as municipal government funds and efforts and various little projects like this. And unfortunately for us, the Kootenay Lake area has a significant amount of knotweed. There are a lot of current management efforts going on, as I mentioned, but none of them, at least in our region, currently include private land. So you can see on this map here, I've tried to show the areas that are included in the Kootenay Lake Local Conservation Project area. So areas A, E, and D of the RDCK. And all the brown dots are knotweed sites that we know to be on private land. And then the other colored dots are various jurisdictions that most of which are being managed to some extent or another. So you can see that actually the majority of knotweed that we see and deal with in our region is on private land. And so that's a huge gap in knotweed management for our region, is to not be able to manage those at all. So, you know, knotweed management is pretty difficult and it can be quite expensive. And lots of landowners find that they're not able to overcome those barriers on their own. So the point of this project is to provide a cost sharing and expertise sharing arrangement for private knotweed treatment. So we're going to support private landowners to protect native habitat and keep their property safe, as well as fulfilling their legal responsibilities by controlling knotweed on their land. So I'm just going to take a couple steps back here and give you guys a little bit of an overview of why we care about knotweed, why it's considered invasive. Globally, Japanese knotweed is listed by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature as one of the 100 worst invasive alien species worldwide. So some of the impacts that it has when it's invading new habitat is, the main one is displacing native vegetation. So basically it creates these dense monoculture stands. And knotweed also has an odd feature where it suppresses other plant growth where it's inhabiting the soil by releasing biochemicals. So it's something called allelopathy, but basically it's just suppressing other plants from growing and enabling itself to take over in a monoculture. So when it creates these stands, it reduces the amount and quality of habitat for the various native flora and fauna, and it also creates barriers to animal movement through the environment. Knotweed has a vigorous rhizome system that can also cause shoreline erosion when it dies back in the winter and leaves exposed soils. And generally, overall, studies have shown that knotweed, the presence of knotweed in an ecosystem dramatically reduces species diversity. So those are some of the environmental impacts. And the interesting thing about knotweed is that it has impacts over and above the environmental impacts that create a lot of concern in and of themselves. So some of these other impacts include infrastructure damage. So this rhizome structure that I mentioned is incredibly vigorous and can grow through concrete and pipeline type infrastructure. So it damages foundations, roadway surfaces, water infrastructure. I've got a couple little photos over here of literally knotweed growing through asphalt and the edges of roadsides. Knotweed can also impact property values. So in some highly impacted areas, for instance, Great Britain, properties that have knotweed infestations are actually difficult to sell, and so they have a lower value on the market. And they're also more difficult to get insurance for. It sounds crazy, but it's very real. And then in BC, there's also a legal risk of having knotweed on your property, because if you are not controlling it and you're allowing knotweed to spread onto adjacent crown lands, you could actually be at risk of being charged by a conservation officer. So yeah, knotweed has some various fairly significant impacts, and cumulatively it leads to them being an extremely high species or high priority species. So generally for knotweeds, the reproduction and spread is mainly by vegetative fragmentation. So it has this vigorous, large rhizome structure that can extend up to 3 meters deep and 20 meters wide underneath the ground. So it's way bigger than what you see above ground, and that can be pretty significant, as you probably have seen. So that rhizome structure can store energy and actually regrow for many years, even if somehow you manage to not let the top growth show up. It'll just pop right back up if you stop actively managing it, at least in a manual sense. And then unfortunately, disturbing the top growth, so cutting, that kind of thing, can stimulate the rhizome to spread. So it's definitely, you can see it on sites that have been mowed, it tends to want to spread a little bit further away. And that reproduction is extremely easy to happen. So it can reproduce from stem and rhizome fragments as small as 0.7 grams. Super tiny, it could be just in a clod of dirt on your boot or on a truck tire, and it'll just get moved down the road and it could start a new patch. So obviously it's quite easy to spread, usually completely by accident, just by dumping garden waste or mowing it, just accidental soil movement, improper disposal of garden waste, and like I said, contaminated equipment as well. So my little photo here is an example of Ministry of Transportation efforts to prevent knotweed spread. So we install these signs for the ministry in front of knotweed patches so that their highway mowers don't come along and mow the knotweed and thereby spread it down the highway. So as I mentioned briefly, knotweed has some very significant management challenges. Essentially, after a lot of research and trial and error, basically for large established sites, manual removal efforts like digging and cutting are generally unsuccessful and usually result in increased spread. So as a general practice, that type of management is not recommended for knotweed. And that includes things like smothering, mulching. Just as soon as you stop those efforts, the rhizome will pop right back up. So according to current research, the only recommended management options for knotweed are, number one, and this goes for every invasive species ever, would be prevention. So it's cheap, it's relatively easy, but it does require a high level of public awareness and engagement. Number two, if you already have an established knotweed patch, probably the most sort of cost-effective and generally overall effective method has been found to be a systemic herbicide application, which tends to, it doesn't disturb the site very much, so it doesn't sort of stimulate that rhizome to spread and grow. And the cost overall is moderate compared with other options. And then the third somewhat recommended option is a full excavation, but you have to follow a fairly significant set of best management practices with a lot of precautions, proper disposal of a large volume of contaminated soil, cleaning equipment, It tends to be really high cost and disturbs the site very significantly and has a pretty high risk of contributing to the spread just by accidental soil, contaminated soil movement. So as you can see, this creates some barriers for private landowners to manage manage knotweed on their properties. So hiring a professional herbicide applicator can be quite expensive. And generally, we've found that members of the public don't have a lot of knowledge or understanding about various herbicides, information and risks, regulations surrounding that type of thing. So it seemed to us like a good opportunity to provide support in that area. So the project activities that we're undertaking for this Kootenay Lake Local Conservation Fund project include, we're going to be conducting outreach to landowners where we know there are existing knotweed infestations, and we'll do a bit of advertising in order to hopefully reach other landowners that we don't even know about, because there's probably a lot. We know there's inventory gaps. We'll conduct site assessments for interested landowners to determine if they're eligible, if the site is able to be treated, and develop a safe treatment plan and give them an estimate of the cost of treatment. And then we'll coordinate the actual treatment, and the program will subsidize the cost of that treatment up to 50%. And then the landowners will sign some agreement and get that all set up. And then once the treatment's complete, we'll also be doing monitoring to make sure that they are effective and that all the legal regulations are followed and that sort of thing. So basically, this funding is going to allow CCAS to fill a major gap in regional knotweed management, and we'll be assisting private landowners to manage knotweed for the first time in the RDCK. General community benefits that we're hoping to see from eradicating knotweed would include protection of native habitat and protecting our diverse native plant communities. We'll hopefully be preventing shoreline erosion and preventing knotweed from spreading into sensitive riparian habitats. Additionally, we'll prevent some costly damage to property as well as road infrastructure, which hopefully will keep our taxes down on a provincial scale. And we'll be maintaining property values and preventing our regional infestation from becoming a major concern. And finally, we're very much hoping that this project will lead to increased public awareness, and which hopefully will lead to additional prevention of knotweed impacts in the future. So thanks so much to Kootenay Conservation Program for organizing this webinar and for coordinating the Conservation Fund. And all of this work could not happen without supporting funders and partners, including the Columbia Basin Trust, the Regional District of Central Kootenay, as well as the province of BC. There's a number of different ministries involved with knotweed management and supporting invasive species management in our province.